Hello, my friends. Today, let's start with a statement Lindsey Graham made about how the war could end soon. Putin's economy runs on oil and gas. Cut off those revenues and he's finished, said US Senator Lindsey Graham. According to him, China, India, and Brazil buy most of Russia's energy exports. If they forced Putin to make peace, the war would end. He added that sanctions against leading Russian oil companies have already made China refuse to process Russian oil. This is something you can agree with. Russia is completely dependent on China, and Putin will do what China tells him. Otherwise, Russia's economy will collapse even further. At the same time, there are talks in the Kremlin saying they're ready for negotiations, but they're not saying they're willing to stop the war.
Now, do we at least have some guidance about a possible meeting with Trump?
Well, there's no guidance yet.
None at all.
The basic readiness to hold a meeting, if it's prepared in advance by experts, still stands.
UHO. So that means nothing will happen before the new year.
I don't know. You remember how quickly we arranged the meeting with Anchorage?
As you can see, the usual stories continue about needing a preparation for a meeting and so on. But in reality, we know this meeting could happen by Trump's order in just a few days without any preparation, and Putin must come to the meeting ready to stop the war. If not, there will be no meeting and the war continues. So let's move on to the situation at the front line. We'll start with the Dobropillia direction. Here, despite the successes of the Ukrainian forces, which are real, the Russians are still managing to push forward. They've regained control of Novopavlivka and advanced toward the village of Ivanivka. And they're also assaulting Pankivka and Sofiivka. And yesterday there were reports of attacks on the village of Shahove. The Ukrainian forces demonstrated how they repelled another Russian attack. And the Russians deployed 29 units of armored vehicles in the attack, making this one of the largest offensives in recent times. The attack was notable for the increased number of tanks. Thanks to the timely engineering of defensive positions, effective mine laying, and coordinated actions by units of the Ukrainian defense forces, the Russian attack was repelled. As a result, the Russians lost 15 pieces of equipment, including 2 tanks, 12 armored fighting vehicles, and 1 light vehicle. Russian infantry that dismounted from the vehicles were destroyed by FPV drones. Clearance of the Russian landing sites continues. As we can see, the Russians are throwing both equipment and personnel into these massive attacks. Yes, they still failed, but clearly they are capable of bringing such large reserves to the front, which means their logistics are not fully under Ukrainian control. In the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians continue assaults on Krasny Lyman and are breaking through into the southern outskirts of Myrnograd. There are battles for Novoekonomichne, assaults on Lysivka, Novopavlivka, and Gnativka, ongoing fighting for Pokrovsk, attacks on Molodetske, and breakthroughs near Udachne and Kotlane. Yesterday, there was a statement that the Ukrainian forces brought in more reserves to the Pokrovsk direction to secure the city. But the Russians are attacking very actively, making it extremely difficult to stop them. Here is what some Ukrainian soldiers say about the situation. Pokrovsk, citadel of the city. The situation in this area remains extremely tense. The citadel is essentially the heart of the city's defense, and any collapse here could turn catastrophic. Just a few weeks ago, I said if the Russians secure this sector, it will be a total disaster. And now we're already on the edge of that scenario. According to the latest observations, Units of the 7th Air Assault Corps are targeting the Russians in the industrial zone near the 8th Group area. Fighting continues for every meter, literally for every building. The Russians advanced roughly 800 meters and tried to consolidate, but under our soldiers' attacks, they suffered losses. However, the number of Russians is not decreasing. They keep bringing in additional forces and continue to accumulate equipment and personnel, preparing for further attacks. The citadel hasn't yet been completely lost, but the areas we control are steadily shrinking. Entering these areas is extremely dangerous right now. The territory is under fire, and any movement could end in a hail of bullets. Regarding the so-called stabilization in this sector, which some officers claim, that's nonsense meant to reassure. On the ground, soldiers see a different picture. The Russians are pressing, shaking our positions, and the situation is far from stable. So I'd rather trust my comrade than some command officer 75 kilometers away from the front, fantasizing about peace, stabilization, etc. The reality is harsh and out of touch. Feel free to share your thoughts on this in the comments. And now let's move on to the Novopavlivka direction. Today there are no reports of new assaults here, and for the moment the front line remains unchanged. In the area of the settlement of Pokrovsk, the Russians are assaulting Sosnivka and Pavlivka. There is also a high number of shelling reported, and the Russians are gradually advancing. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, the Russians still have no success. They continue attacks on Novoandriivka, Stepove, and Stepnohirsk. However, there are no advances, and the front line remains unchanged. In the Kherson direction, the Russians continue attacks near the Antonivsky Bridge and carry out shelling. At the same time, the Russians keep claiming that they are striking Korabel Island. In reality, however, it's confirmed that their troops haven't been able to break through onto the island, so all the successes are limited to shelling. Now let's move on to the situation in the Kostiantynivka direction. Here, the Russians have managed to advance close to the city and are assaulting the outskirts. They are also attacking Pleshiivka and Klebanbyk and are breaking through near Rusin Yar. The situation is difficult and the fighting continues. On the flanks, the Russians have no success, but it's clear that they are managing to push through toward the city itself. In the Siversk direction, the Russians are assaulting the outskirts of Siversk and making breakthroughs near Vyimka, Pereizne, and Fedorivka. However, over the past 24 hours, the Russians have had no success, and for now, the front line remains unchanged. In the Lyman direction, attacks are being recorded near Dvorichna with assaults on Drobusheva and breakthroughs near Seredny and Karpivka. However, the front line here also remains unchanged. In the Borova direction, the Russians are not carrying out any new assaults. Over the past 24 hours, the front line hasn't changed. In the Kupyansk direction, the Russians are assaulting Petropavlivka and attempting to break through near Pishane. As for Kupyansk itself, there have been no reports of new Russian advances and the front line remains unchanged. In the Dvorichna direction, the Russians are not carrying out new assaults, and for now the situation has stabilized. In the Velykyi Burluk direction, on the contrary, Russian activity hasn't decreased. The Russians continue daily attempts to advance toward Kolodezne and are assaulting Dvorichna and Bologivka. However, over the past day, they have achieved no success and the front line remains unchanged. In the Kharkiv direction, the Russians are not carrying out new assaults and the situation remains stable. Meanwhile, in Vovchansk, Russian attacks continue. At the same time, the Ukrainian forces are gradually clearing the forest area and capturing Russians. So the fight in the air goes on. In the Sumy direction, the Russians carried out only one attack near Oleksiivka in the past day, but they achieved no success and the front line there remains unchanged. Meanwhile, there is another escalation among Russian war correspondents. They already claim that if not the Russians, then the Poles will surely seize Lviv. When the rightful owners return to Lviv, whether they are Russians or Poles, the riffraff will be driven out to the countryside, and warning signs will reappear at cafe entrances. No dogs or Ukrainians allowed. As you can see, the Russians' dream of Ukraine being completely destroyed, whether by Russians or by Poles. So in short, the circus goes on. And that's all from me. So please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all the latest news. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.